Hello. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about psychoanalysis. Specifically, we'll be talking about Freud's theory about the structure of personality, about the unconscious, and about ways in which the psychoanalyst discovers what's going on in the unconscious. Psychoanalysis. This is a theory that was developed and promoted by Freud. Let's start out with Freud's structural theory of the personality. Freud believed that there were three basic aspects of personality. The first was the id, and according to Freud, the id consisted solely of drives. And the id is the most basic structure of the personality. It is what the infant is born with. The infant is born with id and nothing else. Therefore, the infant is a being that consists solely of drives. Now, Freud believed that there were two essential drives that motivated all behavior. The first one is called libido, and many times people interpret this as being just sexual drive. But libido is more than just sexual drive. It's life instinct. It's a drive toward merging, toward thirst, hunger. That's all part of the libido, and certainly sexuality is part of libido. The other basic instinctual drive that Freud posited was the death instinct, which is basically aggression. So the infant is born with the life instinct and the death instinct. That is, the infant is born wanting to seek pleasure and also wanting to destroy. Now, the id operates on something called the pleasure principle. This is that it wants its demands satisfied, and it wants them satisfied immediately. And it also operates on something called primary process thinking. Primary process thinking is non-logical, symbolic, non-verbal way of thinking. Again, if you think about the infant doesn't have words, doesn't understand anything that's going on around it, but it does understand visual processes. So the id thinks in very primitive ways that are marked by symbolism and imagery. So this is the infant. The infant is just id. It's drives, it's wanting its needs met instantly, and it is symbolic and visual thinking. The ego starts to develop around 6 months of age. Again, this is according to Freud. And the ego is what we think of now as our conscious self, our memories, our thoughts, our intentions. The infant can't exist on just id because its needs won't always be met on demand. Newborn, when it cries, its parent comes and meets its needs. As that infant gets older and it cries, parents don't jump to meet its needs so quickly, and the infant needs to develop an ego in order to figure out how to survive. The infant cries, its needs aren't met, but then the infant can look around and say, aha, there's my bottle over there, or there's a Cheerio, and it can develop a plan for getting that nourishment that it wants. And that's the beginning of the formation of the ego. Now, the ego is based on the reality principle. This is in contrast to the pleasure principle of the id. The reality principle is that the individual tries to get its needs met in a socially acceptable fashion. So rather than wanting immediate gratification, the reality principle is, well, let's see, if I am hungry, how am I going to get something to eat? I'm not going to grab my neighbor's food. I'm going to think about where I can get some food, how I can purchase it, what I might want to eat. So the reality principle is planning and thinking and finding socially appropriate ways to get one's needs met. The ego also involves secondary process thinking. Remember, primary process thinking is nonverbal, it's symbolic, it's visual. Secondary process thinking involves logic, involves verbal reasoning. The goal of the ego is self-preservation. It is finding ways to get its needs met in a socially acceptable fashion. It is survival. So the ego wants to protect one from danger. And this danger can be both internal and external. Internal danger involves instinctual urges that the ego finds too threatening to acknowledge. So as the ego develops, it squelches the id goes underground and the ego takes over. There may be some urges that the id has that are too threatening and too upsetting for the ego to be able to deal with, so it pushes those down. So the ego tries to protect the individual from threatening urges. The ego also tries to protect the individual from external threatening urges. This could be dangerous things, from getting hit by a car, or from starvation, or from getting into a fight. So the ego is our conscious daily thoughts and activities that are geared toward survival. The final structure of the personality is the superego. The superego develops around the age of 4 or 5. The superego is often what we think of as our conscience. It is our idea of what is right and wrong. It is the internalization of the values of the people and the important structures around us. So our parents' values, the values of our church, our teachers, these values are internalized as part of the superego. If we didn't have a superego, the ego would dominate most of our decision making. And again, the ego wants us to get our needs met without getting in trouble. So the ego would have little problem with violating a law as long as we wouldn't get caught. But the superego goes beyond that. The superego tells us what is right and wrong. And when we have a superego, we obey laws because we know it's the right thing to do, rather than because we don't want to get into trouble. Next, we've got the levels of consciousness. Our conscious selves, that's again ego-dominated. That is what we are aware of, what we're thinking at this moment, our memories, our thoughts. Preconscious are things that we aren't currently thinking of, but we can pull them up at any moment. The unconscious, however, still resides in the id, and it is inaccessible. We do not know consciously what is in our unconscious. It is dominated by the id, so it is dominated by urges, particularly aggressive or libidinal urges. If these urges are threatening, then they stay in the unconscious and we are not aware of them. So unconscious urges we are not aware of, and we cannot become aware of them unless, of course, we receive psychoanalysis. Now, if we aren't aware of what is going on in our unconscious, how do we get clues to what the unconscious urges are? The psychoanalyst has several ways of untangling the mystery of the unconscious. One of the ways in which the psychoanalyst understands the unconscious is through dreams. Freud believed that all dreams were in some way wish fulfillment. But dreams are dominated by the id. So dreams are not logical. They often are not verbal. They use symbolism. And the id is always trying to disguise the true meaning of the dream from the ego, because if the ego became aware of it, the ego would become very upset. So the real meaning of a dream is never straightforward. The analyst needs to work with the client to understand what unconscious urges are buried in the dreams. Another way in which the psychoanalyst gets at the unconscious is through things called accidents. Freud called these the psychopathology of everyday life. And according to Freud, there are no accidents. Rather, accidents are ways in which the id lets the urges be known. So things like the slip of a tongue, where somebody might mean to say one thing, but they actually say the opposite. Freud, or the psychoanalyst, would say, aha, deep down inside the person really means what they said. That was not an accident. If a person stubs their toe, the analyst would say, aha, that's not an accident. Actually, the person was trying to hurt themselves. That was the id's aggressive instinct. Free association is another way in which the analyst gets at the unconscious urges. Free association is what takes place in psychoanalysis. Free association involves the client talking about whatever comes to mind. They are not supposed to censor anything, no matter how embarrassing or how silly or how irrelevant it might seem. The point to free association is that if you let a person talk about whatever comes to mind, the id will direct that conversation and give the analyst clues to the urge that is unconscious and is pressing for expression. It is very important for the psychoanalyst not to lead the discussion, not to ask the client questions, but to allow free association to take place. Because if the psychoanalyst does try to lead the psychotherapy by asking questions, then it will stop the id from directing the conversation, and the psychoanalyst will not be able to get these clues as to what is actually going on in the person's unconscious. This is why the analyst is usually very quiet and only asks questions when the analyst thinks that they're getting to some important unconscious information. And the final way in which the analyst gets at the unconscious is through hypnosis. During a state of hypnosis, the analyst can have freer access to the unconscious, and people will be able to tap into the urges that they would not otherwise be able to tap into when they were not hypnotized.